you are busy with one of your mundane tasks, ironing your clothes. What if your iron is malfunctioning? What do you get? For me, it is basically burning my clothes. Since I am using synthetic fabric, it melts easily. And yes, I did have it on the lowest heat possible. That's how I know got a malfunctioning iron. Well, it's nothing to stress about. You simply need to go and mend if you know how. I do know how to mend my clothes, although in the beginning I did not want to. Where do you start when mending your clothes? By finding a piece of fabric that is as close as possible to the original. The skirt I have sewn myself. I still got the scraps. And yes, it's large enough for the piece that I need to remove. The ideal size of your piece of fabric that you will use. It is basically your seam allowance that you add. If you could draw a square, how do you know how big size of a piece of fabric you require? You start with how large is the piece you have burnt, or in my case, melted. That plus seam allowance around. But to be clear, if you cut around in a block your burnt or your melted piece, you need to have seam allowance extra. That's your line. And on your piece of scrap, it is the size of your actual block plus seam allowance. So we are now, if you're going straight to cut a piece of fabric square, it is your melted piece or burnt piece in a block plus 2 times your seam allowance. Folding one seam allowance all over, pin your fabric over the burnt or melted piece, making sure you leave at least a seam allowance width all over to have it centered. Next is to sew your new piece of fabric to your damaged garment. First major tip to get it nearly invisible, as what I've discovered with this particular fabric of mine. Easier, I've used mini mat. You will be sewing a whip stitch all around your fabric. The size of your whip stitches needs to be equal to a thread width. Ideally, you'll be catching one thread of your garment and one thread of your patch per stitch. When you go to your next area to sew, it's the next thread from where you have sewn. I know this is extremely fine sewing, but it's worth it for a nearly invisible patch done. Once you have sewn all around your patch, this is where it gets tricky, because now you need to go into your garment and cut out basically from the sewing line your seam allowance width, and hopefully you have measured correctly, or maybe willing to go a tiny bit small on your seam allowance if it was not lined up, and cut away the burnt or melted piece. I like to iron my seam allowance basically the open. So it's first to make sure it stays open, I press it open. A rough bad job, but it's in between ironing and pressing. You need it to stay properly open for the next step, which is the second step, having your patch almost nearly invisible. Then you'll turn your fabric around where the right side is facing up again when you're ironing. Then it's again wetted to press. It's not just plainly pressing. Because you press the iron on it and basically pull away from the patch all around. This will force your seam allowance, which is something like this, fits together, to be more of a flat For me, because I did not keep my hands clean while sewing, and this is almost a white piece of fabric, all I had to do is throw it in the wash, hang it up, that piece up to dry, and once it's dry, then it's quickly ironing it like you would do with a normal garment, and then enjoy wearing your mended piece.